Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our March 1st Friday here at the School of Public Affairs at the University of Colorado, Denver. We're delighted that you're here. We have several folks online, Zooming and streaming, which is one reason we have the microphones and things so that they can hear everything. I'm Paul Teske. I'm the Dean of the school, and delighted again that you're here. This, for those of you that have been to other First Fridays this year, we're have our theme of 50 years of, because it's the 50th anniversary of CU Denver and of the School of Public Affairs. And so in the fall, we looked at 50 years of demographic changes in Colorado, politics, nonprofits, criminal justice. And then this semester, we started last time in February with 50 years of public finance, Tabor, and other issues. And today we're going to talk a very big topic of 50 years of social equity conversations, and we have a fabulous panel and moderator for that. Just some logistics first. As you can see, there's excellent breakfast in the background provided by Elo Epicure, a small locally owned enterprise, and so we're delighted to have that catering. There's bathrooms around the corner. We'll go till about 10 o'clock today, but we're not kicked out at 10 o'clock, and so if you can stay or if you want to continue chats and conversations, or if there's food left, please feel free to take advantage of that. Let's see, for questions, if you're interested in asking the panel a question, there are 3x5 cards that we'll collect and get to our moderator as we get towards the end of the time to get to those questions. And please, we're not looking for direct audience questions. That gets complicated with the Zoom, et cetera. So the 3x5 card is the best way for us to do that. As you've seen the land acknowledgement and other slides that have been moving along here, I want to acknowledge our land acknowledgement, especially today in this conversation, since we're on the ancestral land of the Cheyenne, Ute, Arapaho, and other tribes. And that's something very important to acknowledge today. As well, we want to acknowledge that the campus, the Auraria campus for CU Denver and Metro State and CU Community College of Denver, was built more than 50 years ago on what was a working class Hispanic neighborhood. And there's still some of the buildings left. We have the 9th Street project to kind of memorialize that and symbolize that, but that's something we also want to acknowledge. With that, I'll say that I'm excited about our panel and thrilled that thank you for coming. And I'll introduce our moderator. We're fortunate to have John Ronquillo, professor at the School of Public Affairs, who, grew up in Arizona, earned both his undergrad and master's from Arizona State, his doctorate from University of Georgia, which is one of the top schools in organizational behavior and management and public affairs more generally. John's been here at SPA for 9 years, I'm going to say, and previously at DePaul University. John's research has touched on tribal governance and other social equity issues and social entrepreneurship and a range of other important topics. So please join me in welcoming our panel and our moderator, John Ronquillo.
Hello. Good morning. Paul, thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm so excited to take a seat. Now, I'm excited to welcome our distinguished panelists today on what is a very important discussion. Paul mentioned that I do some research in social equity, and I think about panels like this, where I look at individuals who look a bit like me, individuals who otherwise just decades ago may not have been leading a panel in the presence of so many people at a university. And so in terms of making strides in social equity, I think that we have the ability to have a good discussion today that reflects on those moments, but also that digs a little bit deeper in terms of where we are with our community here in Denver in particular. As you know, it is the university's, as well as the School of Public Affairs, 50th birthday. And so we are having these conversations in order to focus on our strong points, where we are able to make inroads. I have a slide up there that shows just a couple of publications. There are myriad publications from folks who've been affiliated with the School of Public Affairs for years around social equity in terms of our scholarship. You'll see a common thread in our distinguished alum, Sean McCandless, who has written extensively on this. He and Mary Guy edited a book called Achieving Social Equity, which has gained a lot of traction. And Sean and I were both involved in the creation of the new Journal of Social Equity and Public Administration, which Dr. Mary Guy is now the co-editor of, with Brian Williams at the University of Virginia. And the last point on that slide, it shows Guy's and McCandless's 2012 paper on social equity, its legacy, and its promise. Before we dive in and introduce our distinguished panelists, I just want to read very briefly from the abstract of that paper, so that gives us a little bit more of an idea of what we're talking about when we say social equity. They write that social equity is rooted in the idea that each person is equal and has inalienable rights. Because of America's unique blend of social, religious, economic, and political characteristics, we value this concept despite, or perhaps because of the simultaneous tensions of a capitalist economy, which requires inequality, set within a democratic constitutional system, which assumes equality. The impossibility of simultaneously achieving inequality and equality produces episodic corrections. This was the case in the tumultuous 1960s, a period when the usually tame notion of equity gave rise to heated debate and resulted in calls for social change. Now, tumult in the form of economic inequality, unemployment, and globalization is a harbinger of renewed interest. This article explains the roots of the concept. I don't need to tell you that, but this article was written in 2012. And 11 years later, here we are, and I dare say that there are indeed many corrections that we can address. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists. They will continue to introduce themselves as we get into our questions. Immediately to my right is Dr. Aisha Rousseau. Welcome, thank you for being here. In late 2021, Mayor Michael Hancock appointed Dr. Rousseau as the Chief Equity Officer of the Mayor's Office of Social Equity and Innovation, where her primary focus has been to continue advancing the inclusion of equity into all city departments and programs. And prior to that, she served as the Director of the Division of Disability Rights for the City and County of Denver, and was previously an assistant professor at the University of Arizona. And next, thank you, Dr. Rousseau, welcome. And next we have Daniel Ramos, one of our distinguished MPA alums, who currently serves as the Executive Director of the Colorado Democracy Alliance, who you may recall was for several years the Executive Director of One Colorado and was nationally involved with the LGBTQ Victory Fund. He has been a trustee of the Rose Community Foundation as well as Colorado Mesa University, and he also serves as an adjunct professor at the University of Denver. Daniel, welcome and thank you for being here. And last but certainly not least, for those of you who have been in Denver and paying attention to activity in politics and civic engagement in general, we are so glad to have Rosemary Rodriguez with us, who from 1997 to 2002 served as the clerk and recorder for the City and County of Denver, and then subsequently served on the City Council for a number of years, including as council president. She was also a commissioner to the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. And so I assume you have been deeply attuned to a lot of the elections issues that we've been witnessing over the past several years. And she did that and then subsequently returned home to Colorado and served as Senator Michael Bennett's state director for a number of years as well too. Rosemary, Daniel, Dr. Rousseau, thank you so much for all being here today. Very excited to have you. So let's dig into this if you are ready. Okay. So Rosemary, I'm going to start with you and work our way back here. Can you talk a little bit about your vantage point on social equity and what you see as maybe one or two major transitions or evolutions that social equity work and conversations have gone through in the past decades?
Thank you, John. For me, it starts with the takeaway that people have from social policy and services. Do they feel like they were a part of promulgating or making decisions about the things that happen to them, or do things just happen to them? And I am extremely encouraged by some of the work that's going on in Colorado right now. I had the opportunity to visit the Brown Ranch in Steamboat Springs with the Gates Family Foundation earlier this year. And all of the collateral materials and presentations were done in Spanish first, because that's who will likely be living in the affordable housing that's being built there. And so it sort of turned the outreach completely 180 degrees. It was done for the end user, and they're involved in decision-making and recommendations and naming and everything. And the English speakers in the audience were in the position of catching up a little bit. And it was super exciting, very, very organic from that community. And to me, it was an exemplar project of a different approach to working on systemic solutions in that community. So I guess my perspective is, did we have to storm the gates? And I say we, I mean people of color or other disadvantaged people. Did we have to storm the gates, or were we invited in? And I'm encouraged that there are more occasions of being invited in that that are occurring today. I've been on the side of storming the gates for many, many years, and within the last 50 years, and you can get things done, but it's just a lot harder.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. Daniel, from your perspective, your vantage point, what are the changes or transitions that you've seen in your experience?
Yeah, well, good morning, everyone. It's nice to be here, especially as an alum of the School of Public Affairs. I mean, I think a couple things, really. I think the first is really the concept of power and how it's shifted and evolved over the past many years. And I'll say that a little bit from my own experience. For those that don't know, I grew up in Sterling in Northeast Colorado, a rural farm town. My mom worked at a grocery store. My dad worked at a beef plant. And I'm the first one in my family to go to college. And so growing up in rural Colorado, we didn't live in a particularly political family. My family we didn't grow up voting. And I happened to, end up find my way at CU Boulder as a first generation college student, and ended up with the Governor's Opportunity Scholarship, where I had the opportunity to do a number of things. And one of those things while in my time at CU was I got to intern for the assistant majority leader back in 2006, where I learned how this whole thing works, this whole thing about public policy, this whole thing about advocacy, this whole world that I had no idea existed. Particularly as someone who grew up on Medicaid and someone who grew up with the benefits, to the point that Rosemary made of does it happen to us, or do we help make it happen? And so so I think I took that that perspective into the work that I as I was learning it at CU, and then got involved in student government quite a bit and started my sort of activist career, if you will, in student government, advocating for access and affordability in higher ed, most specifically through the United States Student Association, which is essentially a union for student governments. And so this was sort of the time of the recession and advocating for Obamacare and a whole host of other things. And then come 2010, I graduated college with a sociology degree in the height of the recession, and there wasn't much for me to do. And so I moved away to California. I worked on the mayor's race I worked for the mayor of Palm Springs, who was running for Congress, and and then we lost, and I moved back home, and I started my career at One Colorado, the state's leading advocacy organization for LGBTQ Coloradans and their families. And so one of the things that I think a lot about in this space is there was so much of the concept of power out there that I was completely unaware of. And in the time that I spent at One Colorado was really thinking about how can I help others actualize their own power. I think a lot about my own family. One day, I think we were lobbying for civil unions way back in the day. We're coming up on the 10-year anniversary, interestingly enough. But, I talked to my mom one day. I was like, I'm going to the Capitol. I've got to go lobby this bill. And her question to me was, wait, you can just walk into that building? And so it's that piece, right? Are we being invited? Are we, do we even know that that's there? And so I think about the role that I get to play in helping people actualize their own power, of how we now have opened up and made this process a lot more accessible. Whether it's, if you look at our legislature, we have one of the most diverse legislatures in the country. When we actually talk about reflective democracy, our legislature is what that means. We have the largest delegation of LGBTQ elected officials in the country. We have 13 in the building. We have more Black and Latino legislators, and we had a majority women, but we lost we lost that note through a resignation. But when we really look at seeing ourselves in the building, and as John said, seeing ourselves on this panel, that's really the transition that I've seen over the past many years. Is that even from the work that I do in the nonprofit space now, is there are more executive directors of color that aren't just leading organizations working in communities of color, but are leading a whole host of other organizations. And so when we think about that type of transformation, that people say that I can lead that organization, or I can be a part of this process, and I can help bring others along so that they can engage and help find their voice. One of the favorite stories that I have is Representative Breonna Tattone, our first transgender lawmaker, the second in the country. And she came to one of our lobby days when I was at One Colorado, and she will tell the story that from her first time at lobby day, then she ran for office in one of the most competitive state legislative districts, and she's now one of the highest ranking transgender people in a state legislature in the country. And so that's the story we've got to tell of how we continue to think about power in these ways of how do we fight for it, and how do we give it to other people.
Fantastic. Thank you. I definitely think that speaks to Colorado's unique position in the country, and is a state where we have valued what it is we're talking about today. Dr. Rousseau, from your very unique perspective, and you've examined it from different angles, talk to us again about vantage points, maybe in particular from where you see it now in working with the mayor, and how you're working with the city to increase equity in various areas. What have you seen is a couple of different transitions or evolutions in your work?
Yeah, I'm really reflective this morning in thinking about how I even came to equity work and the evolution that I've seen over the years. I often share that I stand on the shoulders, not just of my ancestors, but specifically my parents, two civil rights babies, one marched with Dr. King, the other marched with James Bevel, the gentleman who Common portrayed in Selma. And I was just watching Selma recently with them, and they were reflecting on their time and what it was like marching, and to see it on the big screen. And so I oftentimes, when my folks are 80, my mom will be 78 on Monday, I oftentimes ask them, what has changed and what is really still the same? How much progress do you truly think we've made? And so I'm always intrigued by the insights that they share coming from segregated neighborhoods. My father came from an area where they weren't even allowed to see a doctor unless the doctor really said, okay, granted them permission to come and see them, or to come see him. And so I look at the evolution that they share with me, but then I also look even in my time. I am a former professor at the University of Arizona in the Medical College of Virginia. My research area is health disparities. And so I look at where we've come, where people would say these aren't really topics that we want to hear. People aren't necessarily interested in hearing about health disparities or about how communities of color are impacted by these various issues. Can't you study something else? Isn't there something else that's more intriguing? And so I think about this quote or this abstract that came from 2012 and where we are now in 2023. I think that I think again about my parents from the 1960s to the early 2010s to even now. We still have a group of folks who are telling us that this isn't interesting. No one cares. Can't we move on to other topics? And so while many things have changed, there are some things that have very much stayed the same. And so I think it's important for us to oftentimes reflect on the history of where we've come. Otherwise, we are doomed to repeat some of the same mistakes. And so I appreciate this example of, are we invited in or do we storm in? I think it's a delicate dance of both sometimes. And so while there are so many things that we have made great strides in, even to have conversations like this, there are still many areas that we still have strides to make to help people understand that reaching equity is not a situation of folks having to relinquish something, but it's about bringing everybody to the table.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I think just to expand on this a little bit and maybe be a quasi panelist here, I think what each of you has mentioned in terms of your own personal story is really important. In my own work, I talk a lot about positionality. Why do I do the research that I do? A lot of people say, why are you so concerned about Native Americans and indigenous leadership and tribal governance? Well, that's because nobody paid attention to it until relatively recently. It's an area of our literature that is incredibly sparse. But also in terms of my own identity. I grew up in a mixed race household. My father is Apache and Mexican. My mother was white. And so I grew up code switching. We talk about code switching, this interesting liminal space. The fact that I'm privileged enough to say the word liminal with letters behind my name after a lot of education. When, my own grandfather barely got his GED. My father did not attend college. My parents did not know what to do with me. So having these opportunities and being able to have these conversations, I think there's a difference between individuals who check the privilege of others and those of us who check our own privilege and are grateful for the opportunities we've been given. Dr. Rousseau, I want to stick with you for a minute, and we'll work our way back to Rosemary, a little back and forth here. You referenced the abstract, and I always think of that word corrections and the abstract that they talk about. I think about the summer of 2020, which saw some of the most heated scenes. Some people would choose to use the word violent, but I oftentimes think that if we use the word violence, we have to think about what precipitated that violence. Summer of 2020 obviously brings about George Floyd, a lot of racial issues, and oftentimes we conflate social equity exclusively with race, but we know that it goes much deeper than that. But then that brings to the question, the definitions around social equity, right? It's not, at least academically, it's not something new that we talk about. We've talked about it for decades, but I think the contours of these definitions change somewhat in terms of at least our own understanding of what it is. So I want to ask you, how have you seen the definitions or the concept of social equity change, at least over your career? And do you feel that most people understand what it is?
Great question. It has definitely evolved. One of my pet peeves when I came into my position in October of 2021 is that I used to have a running joke that if I took a drink for every time somebody said equity and misused it, I'd be drunk by 9 a.m. And so I really work to help people understand we set a very streamlined definition in the city of county of Denver of what we meant by equity, because it was getting used in some really interesting ways. And I don't oftentimes think that folks really know what the definition is around social equity. What I would say is that it has certainly evolved. I don't necessarily know that I thought that it was such a commonplace terminology that was used before the murder of George Floyd in 2020. I was reading a statistic just this morning that was saying how many corporate organizations brought in DEI experts or chief equity officers, if you will, from 2020, and how they have drastically declined, even in by 2023. And so everyone was putting out the statements saying social equity. Everybody was saying we're for it. Everyone was doing all the things. And then we fast forward to 2023 and like you look on the horizon and you're like, okay, maybe some people are still with it. Maybe they aren't. I think part of what the confusion, I oftentimes struggle with this disconnect between how we operationally define things in academia and how terms are then turned around into common vernacular, and sometimes there's a disconnect between the meanings. And so I'm often encouraged by having conversations with folks in academia where we can talk about what do we actually mean by social equity versus how it has been kind of retermed and re-explained in common vernacular. We are in our local government in the city and county of Denver, we are race forward. We really do push that point that we are race explicit, but we are not race exclusive. And that is really because there have been a lot of areas, again, I'm the former director of the Division of Disability Rights in the city of county of Denver, where we really were clear about disability rights or human rights. In the human rights and community partnerships, we were very clear about our advocacy and our space in equity issues. But there is this very unpopular stance about identifying that when we are talking about social equity, that we are highlighting and we are bringing to the forefront the issue of race and ethnicity. And so we've had to be bold in our stance in saying that. It has not come with a considerable amount of pushback, but I stand on the idea that in this concept, in this space of talking about social equity, that we are remiss in this country to talk about all these other marginalized groups, and not that there are not marginalized groups, but we are remiss not to say that we are not talking about race. In any area that you will look at in the United States with marginalized groups, when you factor in race, it adds an additional dynamic. So we're remiss not to include that as a pertinent factor.
Fantastic. And I appreciate your earlier comment too, especially traversing around medical and health issues. I think there's a lot of discussion about that. I know I'm very interested in sort of melding some emerging work that's coming out of public health in terms of confronting racism as a public health crisis.
Yes.
And from the state's perspective, from a public administration perspective, I think there's a lot of corrections to be done in rectifying in terms of what the administrative capacity of the state has done to foment racist ideas and be a part of that. So future research of mine, I want to investigate that a little bit deeper, but also the elements of intergenerational trauma, which a lot of scientists are now saying, not now saying, but have been saying for some time, it is a thing.
Yes.
The trauma can be hardwired and encoded in our DNA, and generations beyond ours can very much see the effects of that. And so I do think that the racial element has to be confronted. And I appreciate your use of the word bold. I sometimes think people, look at these conversations that we have, and there's a lot of courage that it takes to do what we do. But I sometimes think that courage is lobbed at us in sort of a condescending way, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And so I think boldness is a good word to show that we're being proactive and going beyond courage and making that necessary change.
Yes.
I appreciate that. Daniel, we're going to move on to you. In your estimation, do people get what social equity is?
No, I mean, I appreciate the question, because I think the thing I've seen the most is there's more and more disconnect with what we mean by equity from what we say versus what we do. And I think that, this is, interestingly, one of the things that I appreciated most about, when I was figuring out what I was going to do after college, I thought I wanted to go to law school, and I decided to get an MPA instead and then go and be a practitioner, which I found incredibly valuable because as you mentioned, right, is like in academia, there are terms, and then the applicability in spaces looks very, very different. And I think what we saw happen around 2020 was that folks thought by just learning the language, meant that they understood exactly what we were doing and where we were going. And then when folks started to see some of the changes that were required to live equity, that they were not okay with it. And I think we've seen we've actually lost some ground, in my opinion, on equity, because when folks really start to see that it's more than words, it's more than using the right language, it's more than adding another letter to LGBT, it's more than doing and so on and so forth. And so I think we have, I sit now and really think about, like, where do we go from here? Because I think one of the things that I see in my work now is that there's sort of this expectation that people use the same language that we do, regardless of how things have played out for generations. And what's end up happening is that a lot of this language is that folks are sort of talking at or across each other, and people don't actually understand what we mean. And there's such a fear of quote unquote being canceled that people can't actually ask clarifying questions anymore. And so when we think about what equity looks like, no one actually wants to talk about it anymore. No one actually wants to ask what it looks like or what do we mean. And so we now have sort of folks kind of floating around, almost as these these sort of, senseless automatons in a way of just like, got it, code word equity, need to use it in this space. And we don't actually know what it means anymore. And so I think the real opportunity for both academia and for the practitioner space is to really start to talk more about, to really sort of unravel what we mean by equity. That, if we put it in our policy, the things that we look at, are explicit about salaries. We have, maybe we have things like choice points where we're really aware of when we sort of take a step back and ask ourselves how bias is showing up in the decisions that we're making or in the conversations that we're having, or we're giving people permission to use the wrong word or the wrong pronoun, and then working with them to kind of help bring folks along. And so I think that we've lost this sense of like, how are we really pulling people into this conversation about the type of world that we want to live in? And we now sort of have this expectation because the words took off. And I think during 2020, a lot of people didn't really have much else to do other than learn a vocabulary that was, far from their real understanding. And so, I think we've lost some ground. But what I'm hopeful for is that we can really start to figure out, as maybe some of the practices, we may not see the titles anymore, but maybe some of the practices have been embedded in some of these organizations and institutions where we can really start to think of what is the applicability rather than the intellectualization of what we mean by equity.
I love that. Thank you. I think that's a great thing to say. I'm going to come back to you for our next question because you said some things that I think can help us deepen this conversation a little bit. Rosemary, in terms, pardon me, of your experience and your knowledge around social equity and its definitions, what have you seen in terms of people's understanding of this from your point of view?
So this is where the conversation can get very painful. I've been on the board of an organization where we had a staff-driven conversation about equity in our policy making, and it completely fell apart. The majority members of the committee, speaking of white people, felt very threatened and attacked, and I came to the conclusion that I would never participate in a staff-driven exercise again because it exposed the staff in almost a dangerous way. And so staff came in, did our training, left, and here was a room full of very ego-shattered people, and I felt like it was my responsibility to try to, relate to them and build them up, and it was a terrible situation. Contrast that with the Colorado Children's Campaign, where we brought in a professional facilitator for the conversation, came up with a public-facing document, the best practices that we believe help to craft equity-informed policies. We also have an internal checklist. I mean, you don't want to say, oh, check the box, but it's a great tool internally. Before we start any conversations, we go through the list and say, okay, we've got to be mindful of these 5 points. And it really has enhanced our experience as a governing board and really improved, I think, the staff lots of times staff will drive boards a little bit farther than boards are ready to go. We had an eager staff, and it's one of the most healthy organizations that I've ever participated in. And finally, I'm on one committee that is intentionally bipartisan. I'm not going to name it, but I wanted to add equity work into our policymaking and was completely shut down. And kind of along partisan lines. So we have so much work to do, but sharing exemplars, I think, is a great starting point.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think that goes along with where I want to steer us a little bit now. Daniel, I'm going to come back to you because you said a lot of things actually that have been really great. Appreciate hearing your story, and maybe a quick shout out to our accelerated MPAs who are in the audience. Thanks to Dr. Todd Ely for bringing them down. When I had them in their first quarter, I did my best to talk about some of the academic stuff and then encourage them to sort of flip those theories on their heads in terms of what things are really like. And you and Rosemary both have alluded, at least within some organizations, maybe in these nonprofit structures, again, noting the number of executive directors of color. I sometimes wonder what the board composition looks like of some of these organizations. That's certainly an area where we need to make some strides. You mentioned compensation as an example, and I appreciate sort of drilling down into those areas that are so important to us, right? In terms of salary equity, we've seen, the disparities in terms of cents on the dollar, in terms of what women get paid versus what men get paid, and then obviously there are certainly discrepancies for a lot of various reasons. And those are areas that I wish we could, and I believe that we should focus on more. But I think in terms of listening to what all three of you have said, looking at some of the social regressions that I feel that our country is going through in our very interesting federal form of government, we know that there are a lot of states that are trying to roll certain things back. I cringe when I say the word Florida, and minor apologies to anybody who's from Florida, because I'm certainly not meaning to directly assault your state. I love the beaches, I love the art, I love lots of things about it. But, Rosemary, in terms of what you're saying about partisanship or bipartisanship, we wade into these political discussions inherently not wanting to be political, but I don't see calling out a governor who is definitely overreaching in terms of what academic freedom is, or assaulting curricula that talks about Black history, or creates a bill that will punish you if you say the word gay in your educational institution. We have a panel up here with members who belong to the LGBT community. We have a panel up here of all people of color, mixed or otherwise. And so it really makes me wonder when we see legislation in places like Montana or Tennessee who's trying to outlaw drag shows, or other institutions that are trying to not allow us to say terms like DEI or social equity. How do you advance? How do you make the corrections that Guy and McCandless were referring to in their paper when things like this are happening? So, Daniel, the question I want to start with you is, we know that social equity isn't universally accepted, right? And so social equity or allied terms, like some of the ones that I've mentioned, can trigger not only just some concerns in some people, but visceral reactions. And so what are your thoughts on how we can deal with any of these things, ranging from just differences in opinion to an all-out assault on the rights that have been gained over the past several decades?
Yeah, I think sort of the big picture of all this is, really sort of what I'm seeing around the threats to democracy. What it means to actually participate in a civil society, who has access to participation, who gets to make the decisions, who's reflected, and so on and so forth. And so when I think about a lot of these rollbacks, when I think about whether it's access to abortion care or what you learn in your school or the type of healthcare that you can receive, I think that's the irony of it all is that, when we start to think of conservatives in a lot of ways of being a party of freedom. And what we're now seeing is this limitation of freedom. We are literally seeing this sort of the governing, the policy making of how people should live their lives, and what is normal, what is normalized, what is reinforced. And so I think it's really dangerous for democracy in a lot of ways. The other piece that I think is that where I see some real challenges is that we're also sitting in a moment, particularly now, as I mentioned earlier, of people not really asking questions, not really digging in, not really learning more about things that they don't know about, sometimes out of fear, is that we've lost this sense of journey stories of I think growing up in the LGBTQ movement, I was really fortunate to grow up in the marriage movement as well, where we did a lot of Republican work, we did a lot of faith leader work, we did a lot of business work. And so it was really sitting and thinking, I know that, that the onslaught of really terrible legislation, there have been over 430 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced so far this year in states across the country. And many of them will pass. Many of them will pass. It is, when we think about where Colorado sits, as Colorado has some of the best protections for LGBTQ people in the country, has access to abortion, has really comprehensive non-discrimination laws, and it's far from what many of our neighboring states experience. And so Colorado will be a political refuge in a lot of sense for people to live and raise their families and do the things that they need to do. So I think what we've got to think about in the short term is that that might be where we sit. And to know and to recognize it's going to be brutal. It is brutal, to sort of see the dehumanization of so many folks of color, of the LGBTQ community, of low-income people, of Native and Indigenous folks. We're seeing it happen all over the country right now. And so I think the thing we need to think about is where are the places where we can really dig in and start to build some real relationships. We know in a lot of these states that there are actually, there was I didn't read the article, but a story this morning of a Republican from Utah who voted against a trans ban, that we know that there are folks out there, that we need to start telling more stories. We need to start inviting them in. We need to go along with them on their journey. And, one example that I'll use is, former state senator Don Quorum, back in the days of civil unions when we were working on this issue, he has a gay son. He's a state senator from Grand Junction, the Grand Junction area, as a gay son, and he voted against civil unions in 2012. And what we did at One Colorado was we said, he may have not been with us on that issue, but we know the work is not done. And we continued our work with him for many years. And he ended up sponsoring bills like our ban on conversion therapy, our bill to ban the gay and trans panic defense. And so when we thought of this work, and I think this is the example, these are some of the examples we need to be thinking about, is no right now doesn't mean the conversation is ended. A no, it means that there are ways that we can start to dig in to figure out where we can start to drop some hints, to start to pull people in and to be a part of someone's journey story. It's incredibly powerful to be a part of that story. And we need to, give people more permission to ask questions, to understand, to know what they don't know. And that's really how we get to this heart of how do we stop this really bad legislation from happening in these really hyper-partisan ways. It's figuring out how to lift up more of these opportunities for more folks to learn and to come along on the journey.
Excellent. Thank you. I think there's a lot of things to unpack there. And I do think that it does go beyond partisanship. You mentioned Senator Quorum, you mentioned the conversations, and I agree that conversations are things that we need to continue, that we don't simply bifurcate the choices and make it a discrete black or white decision like this is how it has to be. You mentioned Utah. Governor Spencer Cox there has been pretty moderate in terms of Republicans and has spoken out against some of these transgender bans, affirmation of care bills that have been trying to be passed. And Senator Mitt Romney voted to codify gay marriage into law so that was not going to be assaulted like Roe versus Wade was by the current Supreme Court.
Yeah.
These things are so difficult to encapsulate in the few minutes that we have left before we take some questions from the audience. But I do want to shift to Dr. Rousseau and ask from your perspective, especially as a position, having a position in a city and county where we have been fairly progressive and where we have had, lots of strides. We can point to a lot of our elected officials. Wellington Webb, when he was elected mayor of Denver, Jared Polis is the first openly gay man to be elected as a governor of a state. We have seen a lot of this trailblazing. And we like to say that representation matters, and it does, but I think we all know that it's not enough. And so on the same theme, Dr. Rousseau, again, the triggers, and again, anywhere from differences of opinion to what we're seeing across the country in terms of repeals and changes that could be deleterious to some individuals. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we'd be remiss not to be mindful and to be watchful of what is happening across the country. Just because it may not be happening in Colorado right now doesn't mean that we don't need to be aware of the issues such that when it meets us at our front door, we know how to confront the issue. I oftentimes laugh when folks are like, oh, we're not the South, we're the Midwest, we're Colorado. But I'm like, yeah, Denver, Colorado was pretty big home to the KKK too, right? So it doesn't have to be that it's the dirty South or the the southern belt of the United States. We have to be mindful of what is happening in Florida, what is happening in Tennessee, such that we can be ahead of the game and saying, hey, we're not going to allow that to come to our particular state. I think about my predecessors in leadership here in the Mayor's Office of Social Equity and Innovation. And I remember having really long conversations with them at the end of the previous White House administration, and possibly the idea of there being a federal law or a federal rule about talking about social equity and how that would impact this office and how it would impact the work and how it would impact the forward progress that we're making just here in Denver. Not because Colorado was necessarily in line with that, but because there were federal rules that had the propensity of being passed. And so we can't we can't put our heads in the sand because we're not Florida and ignore what's going on. We really do have to be mindful. I think about even again, Denver being a very forward city, a very progressive city. In our training of 11,000 employees, we've had employees who have said, you all are communists. This is crap. This is CRT. Nobody wants to hear this, right? It's not this, complete monolith where everybody is like, yay, social equity. So there are certainly folks that, in our midst, probably even in the room today, who are not necessarily feeling this conversation of equity or thinking that this means special treatment for people, or that it means that they are going to have to give up something in order for folks to achieve part of the American dream. And so, my hope is that we're not disillusioned because we are in a progressive city and a progressive state, that we are not disillusioned to believe that there are not those amongst us who are actively working against this idea of equity. And so if we don't speak up, if we are not educated on the issues that are happening, not just again in Colorado, but across the country, we will have a rude awakening.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think, again, sometimes, we're often encouraged to lean into our discomfort when we're in conversations. And I think there are different ways we can do that. And I do think sometimes that there's not really a blanket mechanism for all of us to just accept this for what it is. There are probably different tenets that people may or may not accept. And again, Daniel, going back to your conversation point, I think, again, in terms of gay marriage in Colorado, I think of former Speaker Frank McNulty, who is now a member of the CU Board of Regents. And I'm hoping that he recalls what the reaction to former President Mark Kennedy's appointment was when he came to CU, not to open a wound for anybody, but to confront some of these things and realize that, even in our, system that is very open about our First Amendment rights. Lots of us have gotten, politically engaged. Some professors have even run for office. I don't encourage it, but I think that that is something where Colorado really shines, that we are able to have these types of conversations. Before I alluded to a couple of people, including Mayor Webb, who was a trailblazer, but we definitely have a trailblazer on our panel as well. Rosemary, I feel that you were a very strong voice when you were on council, and an important voice. And I want to ask you the same question as well in terms of the way social equity or some of the allied terms may cause some shifting in our chairs, some aversion of our eyes. Can you talk to us a little bit about your experience and what are your thoughts about how we can deal with these things and maybe assuage some concerns?
I have done conversations. I'm not an equity expert or DEI expert in any shape or form, but I have done some training with primarily educators about mostly with Teach for America, who have said, I'm privileged, I'm white, I'm Ivy League. Do I check my equity at the door, or do I check my privilege at the door when in the classroom? And I reacted pretty strongly to that notion because I wanted them to understand that they could use their privilege to help their students. And the idea that power would be checked at the door, Daniel talked about power. Power is seized. You don't wait to get for someone to confer it. You have to take it. And that earlier in my career, I found myself in many situations where I had to just stand up and assume that I had the right to be in the room and the right to have a voice. That all led me to data. And I don't need to talk about the importance of disaggregating data in this room, but the census right now is taking time to go through over 8,000 public comments about properly giving people the voice in completing their census forms. It should be easy, but it's very complicated. And I had not thought about the impact on Black Hispanics, and the refinement of a question for Hispanics who are completing the census could lead to them becoming invisible within our group. And so the Hispanic classification, I consider myself mestizo, which is a combination of Native and European. But we have a public national meeting in May, the National Census Advisory Committee. And I urge everybody to follow this conversation, because we have Middle East North Africans who are classified as white, but they don't get the privilege that comes with being classified as white, and they want to be more particularly identified. And then we have just the whole confusion about all the questions that apply to people who are Hispanic or identify as Hispanic and can be of any race, as you know. And it's probably the most fascinating thing I'm ever going to do in my life, being part of this conversation. And my term is up in 2 years. And so I'm looking for people to take my place, because now that we have this stake, we've got to hold on to it. And that's the other thing that we have to do in this whole swirl around equity. Put a stake and then bring the next person to take your place, because these opportunities are rare. And I've strayed way off your question, but I really want to underscore that these conversations are going on. The census is a once every 10-year thing. My colleague, Jillian Winborn, formed Together We Count, and she's here in the room. It's once you become part of this conversation, you never want to leave.
That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah, not a strail at all. I appreciate you mentioning these things, in particular, the Middle Eastern North African issue that is coming up, and the ability to identify as such on these census forms. And appreciate you mentioning also the word mestizo, because at a certain point in time that was kind of denigrated. People didn't want to use that word, but now it's one that we're embracing. It's one I have people ask me all the time, are you Hispanic? Are you Latino? Are you Chicano? Yes. Sometimes the discussions get too difficult to have, but there are lots of ways that you can slice it and identify. And I think that it's important. A lot of the work that I've done in Indian country, and people kind of get uncomfortable with that, but it's an accepted term. People say Indian country.
That's right.
And so I get questions a lot in terms of, well, how should we refer to those people? Native Americans, indigenous, and it's like, my little 2 cents has always been, if you ever have an opportunity to find out who their people are, what their community is, what Pueblo in New Mexico they're from, learn that and identify them as that. That's what I've always encouraged. And my hope is always that they learn a little bit about, myriad communities that exist here in the US. Okay, so we're going to shift a little bit. I still have questions from our discussion, but I think some of our audience questions meld into these quite nicely. One of the questions is, what do you imagine an equal world will look like, and do you believe it's possible? I want to enmesh with that one of the questions that we had sent you beforehand in terms of what aren't we getting right yet? So if there's something you could identify as something that we're not getting right yet, and then going into this question of, do you believe that a more equal world is possible? Dr. Rousseau, how about we start with you?
Yeah, I have to remain hopeful. If I was not hopeful, I would not be able to do the work that I do. And so while there are days that it is hard for me to envision that will happen in my lifetime or the generations behind me, at a very core level, what prompts me to get up every day to do the work that I do is because I am hopeful. I oftentimes share with my staff that this isn't quick work. Folks were, Black folks were enslaved in this country for over 400 years. We are, still pushing conversations about LGBTQ rights in America today. Folks are uncomfortable to say the word Black. I hate BIPOC. I hate the term. I'm like, it's an easy out for people not to say Black. Just say Black, Jeff. It's gonna be all right. Say Latino, say Asian American. It's okay. You won't die. Get your tongue around it. You can do it. I have faith in you. We have to remain hopeful. Otherwise, without the hope that we are making slow but sure shifts and changes, we give up. Recently, right here in this room, I didn't even realize that this is where we were meeting today when we were setting up the instructions to be here today. But the last time I was in this room, we were commemorating that our office was responsible for helping to take down the anti-Chinese plaque not too far from here. And we were meeting with the families that were impacted here in Denver, Mr. Lung, who was killed in that particular riot that happened. And so I was saying to folks, while I am proud and I'm happy that my conversation with the owner of that building convinced him to take the sign down, that was a 23-year in the making thing that happened. I didn't even live in Colorado 23 years ago. And so it's almost, if you think about small drops of water over and over and over and over, wearing things down. If we gave up hope after the first 1 or 2 drops of water, we would give up. But 23 years later, I just happened to have the conversation where he finally said, yeah, I'm willing to take it down. But I couldn't have done it without Councilwoman Sitavaca and Councilwoman Torres and Mayor Hancock and Derek Okubo, all of these people who names that I probably don't even know if they had not been part of that conversation. And so it's not a quick work. So we can't be discouraged in thinking that it's going to turn around overnight. We have all of our efforts to put in as we slowly begin to turn this mammoth ship around. It's a long game. It's a marathon. It's definitely not a sprint.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Rosemary, I'm going to go back to you and ask you a different question from Zoom. So thank you to those who are also joining us virtually today. This is a great question. Do you sense that the next generation are understanding of the journey story and able to lead conversations and change strategies?
In a word, yes. I think the next generation, however you define that, I'm thinking of our youth, are extraordinarily creative and equipped for understanding not only complex history, but just shrugging it off and say, we're going to do it differently. And I blessed with a 19-year-old granddaughter who really led the family in a lot of conversations post the murder of George Floyd, and took her parents to protests, took her parents to clean up the Capitol Hill neighborhood, and really led the family through into understanding. And I know so many young people, they're marching today, asking the community to keep them safe in school. I think that the more we heed them, their open-mindedness about their own identities, the more we listen to them, I think the smarter we'll become.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Daniel, I've got 2 questions here that I think are similar, but have some separate aspects to them. One question was directed to you specifically in terms of your opinion on, and I'm assuming this is in Florida, and I did not mean to hate on Florida. I just wanted to illustrate that there are things happening there. It is the location of one of the happiest places on earth, Disney World. And this is asking what your opinion is on the state government wants to do, and I'm assuming around the special district, and where does this, how does this affect the economy there? But also another question that I think is a bigger part of this is, how does capitalism and wealth disparity contribute to the barriers that exist for underprivileged people? Can you address one or both of these issues?
Yeah. Well, what I'll start with really is the power of business. Is that I think you know, one of and maybe this is actually probably part of the bigger piece, is that, you know, we sort of accept this notion that a more equal world means political. And so, you know, there were times where, for example, when, you know, after we passed civil unions, when there were a number of religious exemptions bills that came forward that basically said, my religion allows me to discriminate. It allows me to deny you business. It allows me to deny you a job, whatever it may be, that right supersedes your ability to live in a society. And so this was part of probably the beginning of this conversation in maybe 2013-14, where businesses started to realize that they could no longer be neutral, that they were beneficiaries of many of the, you know, the folks that lived in their communities. You know, when Kelly Brough was the CEO of the Denver Chamber of Commerce, she was unwavering in her support very early on to come out and say, discrimination is bad for business. This hurts our workforce, this hurts our economy. And if people don't feel like they are seen in their workplace, like things aren't going to go well. And so that I think was a total tone change. I mean, if you look at where the US Chamber is, you look at where Disney is and taking, a really strong stance, that's, really been a huge shift over the last 5 or 7 years. The other sort of shift that I'd love to see to this capitalism question, and I've had a few conversations with folks here at CU about this, is what we do around philanthropy. Is that we know that, over the past 50, 60, 70 years, that there is a machine of philanthropy set up on the right that is in service of the status quo, that is in service of, in a lot of ways, white supremacy from the 60s, where they set up, think tanks and institutions. There's a lot of dark money that they move. They play in politics. I mean, and if there's a really interesting article, it might have been the Americans for Tax Fairness, but that basically said that, the billionaires in this country spent to the tune of, I believe it was $88 million in the election. Billionaires, there were maybe like 300 or something like that spent $88 million influencing our elections. And so when we also then think about philanthropy, whether they be, health foundations or community foundations or whatever, one thing that encourages me is that we're actually seeing more organizations now start to talk about civic engagement. They're actually using things like people who should be the loudest are the people who have the least access to power. And so this is huge. It's really transformative. And we've got to take folks along this path, to the leadership of Rosemary and Jillian, that we're leading the Together We Count coalition of making sure that communities impacted or communities of interest were heard. It took us a long time to get some money. We had some fights with the state about the money that was moving into these communities, and we had, we had some very generous foundations that really stepped up to the plate. And so, how do we approach this conversation around how do we depoliticize what a more equal world looks like, where business is investing in equity and foundations and philanthropy are investing in civic engagement and advocacy and really thinking about elevating those voices through, how they made their money, right? Is through capitalism. And so, because again, on the right is they are unapologetic about it. They, oftentimes don't even care if they're breaking laws because they know that a fine is much easier to pay than not winning. And so when we think about what's at risk, that it's that piece in particular of how we need to lean into those voices and really transform how we bring them along as a part of this conversation.
Excellent. And I think a lot of what you said also really embodies why I love being part of a School of Public Affairs, that we're not channeling our students into any, specific career. We're not forcing you to be elected officials. God, please, give that some consideration. But that you have lots of avenues and channels to choose from in terms of how you can influence public policy and how you can be involved, how you can seize that power, right? And, maybe this next generation will be a lot better about sharing it. I know for me, my lane has been education. I'm very concerned about our future leaders. And I think, the civic engagement component that you just touched on is crucial today. All right, in our last couple of minutes that we have left, I want us to address this last question, maybe in a minute apiece, if you can, just as your parting thoughts. But it's a good question. And Rosemary, I'm going to start with you. What advice do you have to continue being bold and advocating for equity in spaces where it has been overlooked, rejected, or ignored?
Advice. I think that the goal should be your driver, and you the long game you have to accept it. It's never fast enough, but it's a long game. It's worth it, and your voice matters.
Perfect. Thank you, Rosemary. Daniel, what advice do you have to continue to be bold and advocate for equity in spaces where it has been overlooked, rejected, or ignored?
Yeah, I think two things. One is to keep showing up. And the second one is to get comfortable being uncomfortable and give people chances. One very quick story I'll tell. When I was the executive director at One Colorado, when we were working on a ban on conversion therapy, I got invited by the president of Colorado Christian University to come and have lunch. And my staff joked that I might disappear. I came back. But the reality was I went and had lunch. We had a wonderful conversation. I understood where he was coming from. He understood where I was coming from. And we had an agreement that we wouldn't attack each other in the media, that if things were to come out, we were going to let each other know. And so we established a relationship and a decorum, even though we disagreed.
Yeah.
And so we need to keep doing that. We need to understand where people are coming from and be comfortable being uncomfortable in these situations.
That's a great story because I think sometimes the media conflates or amplifies what we see in these face-to-face interactions. And I think that that's really important to consider. Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah.
Dr. Rousseau, last but certainly not least, your advice,
Yeah.
and you're the one who brought up bold in the first place. Lay it on us.
Get a therapist.
Yes.
My number one advice, get a therapist. Some of these things we can't always unpack in the office. We don't necessarily always need to bleed on our friends and our family. Get a therapist. The second one is be willing to say you don't know. It's all right not to always have the answer. Be willing to say you don't know and look for the answer. Look for someone who may have the lived experience that can provide the answer. It's okay not to always know the answer to every question, the solution to everything.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. And as it happens, it is now 10:02. We are all still sober, which I think is a good thing to your earlier point. So
Friday.
it is Friday, first Friday. Let it be a happy Friday as well. I want to thank first and foremost all of our guests who joined us in the audience here in person, or if you're on Zoom virtually, thank you for tuning in. But to Rosemary Rodriguez, Daniel Ramos, and to Dr. Aisha Rousseau, thank you so much for joining us on this first Friday. We hope that you will join us next month as well as we continue to celebrate not only CU Denver's 50th birthday, but also the School of Public Affairs. And thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much.